Happy Feast of Tabernacles, Day 3, 1920, 2020. Got hung up in the last century, you know. All right, brethren, good morning. Happy Monday, October 5, 2020 on that pagan Roman calendar. It is the 17th day of the 7th month on God's holy sacred calendar. That means 17th of the 7th month. That means we're at day 3 of the Feast of Tabernacles. We're now on day 3. We'd have gone through about 150 plus another 150, 300, and we're a little ways into 450. So we're getting close to 400 years into the millennium with this day. By the end of this day, we'll have gone through about 425. So we're approaching 400 years in the early morning. By late afternoon, as sun goes down, we'll have completed 425 years into the millennium, at this point in time symbolically into the millennium. By this time, we should have gotten things all nicely cleaned up. In yesterday's feast film, which we're going to repeat that little section today, just so we all make sure we have it straight, right from the horse's mouth, right from the end-time apostle's mouth himself, Herbert Armstrong. Brethren, he reminded us that it's going to take at least, he said, at least 3 generations. And generations can vary. Even dictionary definitions have different time periods for what they call the length of a generation. And some of them list those as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the different time periods a generation can be. Generally, it's 20, give or take a few years. And Mr. Armstrong said at least 3 generations. So we're talking about at least 55, 60 years to possibly 70, 75, 80 years or more before we've cleaned up the mess of World War and the Battle of Armageddon and the pouring out of the 7 last plagues from the 7 vials after Jesus Christ returns. So you're going to hear Mr. Armstrong say it's not going to be hocus pocus. You heard him say that yesterday if you were with us during day 2 of the Feast of Tabernacles live video stream service. It's not hocus pocus. We got some cleanup to do, just like at the recreation when man was created from the dust of the earth. The previous 5-6 days, God spent those days cleaning up the mess on the earth that the devil, Lucifer turned Satan the devil, had made after he tried to go up and take over God's throne. All right, what do we have this morning? We're quickly getting into feast film number. Opening night, we showed the feast film that was the Jubilee year. It's transition from Sardis era to the Philadelphia era. Yesterday, the second day of the feast, we showed a feast film from 1984. The first one was from 1983. Then we showed one yesterday from 1984 on the heart of the children. And I'm going to pick up just some segments of that at the end today, because we're going to repeat a couple of things that we should really know from that. Outstanding. If you missed that, you want to see the whole thing. It's in our archive on our main webpage at cogtv.org. You can see that down in the lower third. Let's see if we can get the lower third up a little higher. Well, at least get my hands closer to it. In the main website at cogtv.org. That stands for Church of God Television. That's not a church group you can join. It's not a quote-unquote church organization of men. This is just a television ministry, the ministry of Jesus Christ via the World Wide Web, via the internet, via television, live video streaming, under the ministry that God's given me to do. It's a ministry. It's not a church group you can join, but you are joined if you're baptized and had hands laid on you and received and are following God's Holy Spirit. You are a part of the body of Christ, also known as the Church of God. No adjectives, no banana peelings. You know, the adjective is the banana peeling of the parts of speech you're your grammar teachers will tell you. And it's a spiritual organism, not a physical organization of men, not a church, not a building that a church meets in, you know, and we already said that, not an organization of men or denomination of men. And it's also known as being called to the spring harvest. If you're called now to become part of God's early kingdom during the time that this feast pictures, during the millennium, we'll clean up the earth first, at least 3 decades, at least 3 generations, that would be at least 6 decades, generically speaking. So at least 60 years, maybe 70, 75, 80, maybe 100 years before we get the mess all cleaned up. And now cities are starting to be what they should be, and people are learning how to truly love one another without envy, jealousy, lust, and greed, or any other form of vanity, with nice clean faces on the women, which are the most lovely faces. All right, that's a subject for you'll hear. Yesterday's feast film, Mr. Armstrong punched away on that. The vanity of painting up, coloring one's face, and then one sermon, we're going to try to find it before the feast is over. Mr. Armstrong emphasized, hits a lectern, pointed out, no one wearing makeup is going to rise to meet Christ in the air. Forget it. You're going to have glorious, shining faces and bodies, composed of spirit, transformed into spirit at that time. All right, now what do we have today? We have the feast film from 1985, which is outstanding, and it goes hand in glove with something that we should do. I'll open this up, and on the scripture screen, which we'll put up full next to us in a moment. That's exactly the scripture I wanted to have to begin with here before we start this feast film. And before we sing at least a little bit of one of the hymns to get you involved, make sure you're awake, and really being able to pay attention to this, all that you'll hear in this feast film from 1985 about the work God did through a certain man, through his most faithful end-time servant, through his apostle to this end time, through whom he raised up the 6th era, the Philadelphia era of God's church, an era that continues until Christ returns, and the next era that'll come into main focus once it becomes an era, doesn't commence as an era, doesn't begin as an era until however you pronounce that. I like to not sound like we're saying an error, like E-R-R-O-R, but era, in a period of time, doesn't commence until the 5th seal opens, the next major event in prophecy, the opening of the 5th seal. Both of those things God's apostle has explained to us, instructed to us, left to us by God through him as doctrine in the church, in the body of Christ. And if you are accepting some other doctrine or teaching against this doctrine by some current so-called minister, that's not a faithful minister of Jesus Christ. Now, he may be a minister of Jesus Christ, but he's certainly not being faithful to the truths that we were taught, nor is he being faithful to God's Word, because this Holy Bible backs up and supports Mr. Armstrong and his teaching regarding when the Laodicean era commences as an era. Now, yes, attitude here been with us since even while Mr. Armstrong was alive. But we'll say more about that. I don't want to get going too heavy. Let's go to this screen over here that I've got Revelation 3 verse 3 on the screen for us to kind of have in our minds as we watch this 1985 feast film. After we sing a little bit of a hymn, I say a little bit because I want to launch into this feast film and get us right into it this morning. And we'll just make sure we're all awake. We'll sing and together Spiritually, we'll sing maybe one verse, maybe two, of a hymn that relates to what this feast hymn is about also. It's about the one through whom God began this era of his church, this end-time church, this Philadelphia era that God said, I open doors and no man can shut, has the key of David, and God compliments the people of this era if we continue to endure, and if, while he watches us without a leader, we stay faithful to the doctrines and the truth the way God gave it to us through his apostle. Now, his apostle is what this verse is talking to us about. There were some ahead of him before the Sardis era. This is a verse mentioned as God addresses the Sardis era. But this principle certainly applies to the next era, this era, the sixth era, the Philadelphia era, where God says, let's bring this full forward on this screen, where God says to us, remember how you've received and heard, and hold fast and repent. Now he's saying, therefore, to the Sardis era, because, let's get that lower third out of the way, because he's saying, be watchful and strengthen the things which you remain, because in the Sardis era, they were ready to die. For I have not found your works perfect before God. And that's exactly the way the situation was when God began raising up Mr. Herbert Armstrong to begin the Philadelphia era. He brought him in through the tail end of the Sardis era, revealed to Mr. Armstrong that we should be keeping the annual Sabbaths as well as the weekly Sabbaths. And when Mr. Armstrong presented that from the Bible to the leaders of the Sardis era, they said, well, we know you're right about that, Mr. Armstrong, but we're not about to teach our people this because our people are dead. We present that to them and we're out. They'll kick us out because, bring this forward again, because just like it says here, you're ready to die. I have not found your works perfect before God. They were so ready to die, they wouldn't accept additional truth. They would not accept keeping the annual Sabbaths. Now, and witness, that group, some from that group that has continued, that have contacted some of the ministry today and have asked, can our people go attend your Feast of Tabernacles with you? And some said, yes. I'm thinking of one that held a feast somewhere, either in California or somewhere in the western states about 10 years ago, and a church group from Sardis asked them, can we come? Well, and they said, well, yeah, you want to keep the Feast of Tabernacles with us? Great, come on. Well, they learned the next year, they said, no, thank you. Y'all just, if y'all want to do Feast of Tabernacles, go do one yourself. Because what happened was the people with this spirit and attitude of ready to die, and how does that say, and the works are not perfect. What they told other brethren, they told our brethren during the feast was, well, we came to keep this with you because, we can keep it, even though we don't have to. So they're spreading this leaven of, you can keep the Feast of Tabernacles if you want to, but you don't have to. That's like some people who say, well, you can keep the Sabbath if you want to, but you don't have to. Where's my buzzer? Somebody hit the buzzer there. Buzz. God, it's something we find a delight to keep the weekly Sabbath. It's something we find even more delightful to observe the annual Sabbaths, including the Feast of Tabernacles with the regular 6 feast days along with the first day, a holy day. We find it delightful, but it is a command that you observe the feast. Now, if you have to stay home to observe it, and some cases that has to be, but you want to take the time for observing this feast. And here we are today, brethren, together on the third day of the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a regular day. It's not a holy day today, but it is a time we convene. And this principle we should want to keep in mind. We're told to remember how you received and heard. Now, how did most of you receive and hear the truth. Let's read the rest of that. And hold fast. Remember how you received and heard it, and hold fast to it. Don't be changing it, watering it down, or allowing some minister you voluntarily submit yourself to water down your thinking and understanding on the truth just because he's an ordained minister who's not staying faithful. And repent, where you haven't held fast, including when the Laodicean era begins. It's important, it's significant, because it will trip you up. And I'll explain that later during this feast, how it'll trip you up by having that wrong. If therefore you shall not watch, I'll come on you as a thief, and you shall not know what hour I will come. And basically what God is saying to us right there if you're not watching, and all that means about watching, including Luke 21:36 style watching, then you're going to be left behind. Revelation chapter 12, verse 17 style. You're going to become part of the remnant that, like he's alluding to or expressly saying in this verse here, I'll come on you as a thief, and you won't know what hour I'll come upon you. I can give testimony about what it's like to have a thief come upon you at an hour you're not expecting, and who probably had a key that I had floating around, unfortunately, to one of my doors. Well, I had all the doors keyed the same, but, now I have separate locks. In addition, I haven't changed that lock, so if somebody has a key to that, they can still unlock that lock, but I have a double lock now. I have another lock on each door. So you not only just got to have one key, you got to have separate keys for each door, because the second lock are not keyed the same. They're all different. And if you don't have the right key for the double lock, you can get the other lock open. You still can't get the door open unless you kick it in, break it off its hinges or something like that. But I had thieves break in my place one night while I was in bed asleep, and I happened to hear a noise in the other room, and I got up to inspect, and I realized that noise sounded like people. And I'm thinking, what is somebody, and it's pitch black, it's dark, wasn't a full moon night, so there wasn't a lot of light coming in from the outside the windows, no lights on in the house. And here's this noise in the next room, and sure enough, as I go carefully down the hall and look in the room, there's two guys in there taking the wiring to one of my computers apart. And they took off kind of quickly with one computer. Now, I wasn't standing there when they took off. I got away from the door. And I went downstairs to see if there was a vehicle out there. And sure enough, there was. It was dark. I couldn't see it that well. I should have got up to the license plate and got that. But I thought, well, I was so sleepy-headed, being woke up with two thieves in my house, I thought I'll run back in and get my camera and take a picture, get a flash, take a picture, and have their license. Well, I ran in to get my camera. When I come back out, I went in and out the side door. They went out the front door. It looks like, I think they came in the back. They left the front door wide open, headed for their vehicle. Well, and when I came back out with my camera, they're gone. But they can't, and they didn't take everything they really wanted. They must have heard me get up or something, and they came back, had got the charger unit, expensive $100 charger unit for that particular Apple MacBook Pro type computer. Yeah, it was a big hoist. Anyway, the point about that is, I can tell you what it's like to experience a thief when you're not expecting it. It can be devastating on you, traumatic to you even, and consequential for those who suffer this thief in the night style, the way God's talking about it here. That means you get left behind, Revelation 12:17 style. All right, take another look at it, and we'll go to the next verse in a minute. You won't know what hour I'll come upon you. That means starting the 3.5-year countdown clock, because once this seal opens up, you've either been taken on two wings of a great eagle in the verse preceding the remnant verse 17 and verse 14 of Revelation 12, it talks about the portion of the woman, the true church woman, who are accounted worthy to escape, being flown to a place where she's nourished for a time and times and half a time. Many of you know that means 3.5 years. And so those who are accounted worthy to escape, they don't suffer this thief coming in on them at an hour they didn't know, because they were watching. They had an idea this is about to come, and they were watching and praying and were accounted worthy to escape. Now those who were not accounted worthy to escape, in spite of the fact they were keeping God's commands, they weren't following the two prerequisites of Luke 21 verse 36, they got left behind. Pow! And then they had to do Revelation 3:18, buy of God gold tried in the fire, the fiery trial of martyrdom. And at that point, the Laodicean era begins. At that point, the fifth seal has opened up with the beasts, Revelation 17 verse 8, ascending out of the abyss, the bottomless pit. Thank you, German Chancellor Angela Merkel will tell you how God expressly involves Miss Merkel, are her people, the people from the stock she comes through later in the program, because it relates to some things in this video today. So, let's do this. Are there any other scriptures I wanted to cover before the video? Let's see. Let me come on back out to a wide shot here, and I'm going to take a quick look and see if we've frozen up. All right, now let's make it go to the next verse. I want to unfreeze. Yeah, okay. I want to unfreeze it because we got some verses we're going to be using during the. Oh, I see. That wound up right down there on the bottom. Okay, I need to bring everything right back, smack up to the top. So we're going to sing a little bit of a hymn, and then we're going to go straight to this feast film. And I've got video with this film. I need to get this queued up, so bear with me just un segundo. Okay, oh, that's what we have to do. Yeah, all right. I'll go ahead and move the verses around. All right. All right, now there's Luke 21:36. Let me put this on the screen for a moment. This is important. All right, we can't emphasize this verse enough, where Christ said, "Watch." I said therefore because in the previous verse he's telling us that the great tribulation comes on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth as a snare, as you see in the first lines up here. It comes like a snare on the whole world. So, and that's why he says in this next verse, other way, Steve, next verse. Well, let's see, I have to go the right direction. Verse 36 is the next verse. Here we are. That's why he says, therefore, here, because it comes as a snare on the whole world. Therefore, watch and pray always, so that, yeah, I'm sorry, it's pointing the wrong way. I've got some preview monitors up over on this side. All right, it says, watch, therefore, because it comes on you like a snare. Therefore, watch and pray always, so that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, beginning with the opening of the fifth seal forward, and on the seventh trump of the seventh seal to be accounted worthy to, bottom line, stand before the Son of Man. All right, you definitely, both those two prerequisites apply to both of the goals we should have. First goal, to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection, and second goal, 3.5 years before Christ returns and seventh trump of the seventh seal, those who are accounted worthy to escape, those who are accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man, rise to meet him in the air and are transformed from flesh to spirit. But 3.5 years before that moment of being transformed, you want to be accounted worthy to escape. Otherwise, you're Revelation 12:17 remnant who has to then Revelation 3:18. Chapter 3:18, Revelation, you have to buy of God gold tried in the fire, the fiery trial of martyrdom, as the great tribulation, fifth seal, begins, and the Laodicean era begins with it as an era. Okay, you can change the attitude. If you're in that attitude yourself, of not watching, not praying. Oh, but we're keeping all of God's commandments. Well, read Revelation 12, verse 17. The remnant of the true church, it says, are those who are keeping the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. What is the testimony of Jesus Christ? It is explained in other places in God's Word as the spirit of prophecy, the Holy Spirit. When God opens our minds with the Holy Spirit, this is a time of fulfilled and prophecy being fulfilled, and of end-time revelations being opened to us, like, well, who are the 5 kings that are fallen? They are Justinian through Charlemagne. Well, who is then of the 7 kings of Revelation 17, verse 10? Who are those 7 kings? Well, 5 are fallen, Justinian through Charlemagne. Justinian through Napoleon. You got Justinian, Charlemagne, Otto the Great, Charles V was the 4th, and Napoleon was the 5th of the 5 kings that are fallen. Then you have the one is, of those 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and one is. There was one who was is, but he was only is, present tense, between 1935 and 1945. Mussolini, and under him Hitler, and with them Garibaldi, who paved the way for Mussolini, was your one is. He was the 6th king. Mussolini was the 6th dynasty, 6th king, the one who did the forerunner type of ascending, verse 8 of Revelation 17, ascending out of the abyss. Thank you, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, for mentioning that to the world as you slapped the UK members of Parliament in the face last year, as you said, when you were frustrated with them for bickering back and forth about Brexiting, not Brexiting, delaying the Brexit date, and some trying to totally get out of Brexit altogether. In her frustration, she pops up and says, "You guys better look into the abyss." And I said, "What? Whoa!" I nearly fell right out of my seat backward right then. Whoa, what in the world did Mrs. Merkel say? Her father was a East German Protestant preacher, you know. And so he was preaching the book. And Mrs. Merkel was familiar with Revelation. And she has some understanding of how God uses the Assyrians, modern-day Assyrians. We'll pop up a verse on that. It's going to apply to something in this feast film today. And God uses, and he explains in Isaiah 10, verses 5 and 6, he uses the Assyrians, and the modern-day Assyrians are your Germans, your Austrians, certain of them, and your people from that area where the Nazis come from. To punish, he uses those people to punish a hypocritical nation, a nation of God's wrath. Well, who would those people be? But those of our forefathers who stood before him at Mount Sinai saying, "Oh yes, Lord, we'll keep your commandments and your laws," and then turn right around and be stiff-necked and stubborn and disobedient. We'll have scriptures popping up during this feast film that relate to that too, and as Mr. Armstrong explains certain things. Very rich feast film today. I hope you can get excited about it, and let's pop out, sing a little bit of a hymn, and then get to it so we have time for the portion of it we're going to planning to play today. Let's put a hymn up on the screen. And yeah, this would be a good one right here. Let's sing Psalm 15, page 14 in the purple hymnal. We'll have the scrolling lyrics right on the screen for you. We're going to go ahead and get that lower third out of the way. And we're only going to sing one verse because we need to launch into this, and we'll sing the rest of this hymn at the end. I just want to get us a little bit involved together, and then we're going to get right into the feast film. Let's all sing together on verse 1, "Who shall dwell on thy holy hill?" Everybody together, verse 1.
He
All right, brethren, and we definitely want to have a sincere heart. We're going to come back and finish up singing more of this later. We want to launch right into this feast film from 1985, which is going to show something very interesting. Mr. Armstrong, I think you'll like my sharing this with you. We're able to understand something that happened in 1985, just before your death, that people should be aware of. I want to roll this ahead about 30 seconds while I tell you. I showed this 3 years ago, so I'm pulling this from that video from 3 years ago because it's easier for me to do it this way for you. But here's in this feast film, you're going to see the G3. You know, Mr. Armstrong for years, for 3 million travel miles, used the G2. And then on August 19, 1985, you'll see in this feast film the new G3. It looked just like the G2, but it was modernized and able to handle the trips overseas that Mr. Armstrong would be taking in the last few months of his life. Now this, again, watch for it in this video when it comes up. You'll see the G3. You know, we are to remember how we heard, how we received and heard the truth. We received and heard it through this end-time apostle, Herbert Armstrong. Even if you heard it from a minister who Mr. Armstrong trained or learned of the truth from someone else who learned it from Mr. Armstrong. It was revealed, these end-time things that kings and priests and people, even all the way back to Daniel, would have given their left hukakula to have understood what the prophecies Daniel was writing down. And the apostle John also, from the Isle of Patmos in 90 AD, even scratched his head, and Daniel was told, go your way, the book is sealed to the time of the end. And even that which John in Revelation added to. He couldn't understand that. The kings that he wrote about that were to have 7 dynasties associated with the power that deceives the whole world. John couldn't understand that. That was just beginning in his day. The 7 kings hadn't even been born yet. But now 5 have come and fallen. The 6th one has come. The one that is between Mr. Armstrong's broadcasting time between 1935 and 1945, and God revealed through Mr. Armstrong Mussolini was that 6th dynasty, that 6th king, that one who was while Mr. Armstrong was preaching between 1935 and 1945. Now he's behind us, and the rest of that verse says, and the other is yet to come, and when he comes he'll continue but a short little space. We're looking for that one. That's the 7th and final. We had Mussolini as a type ascend, verse 8 of Revelation 17, out of the bottomless pit, out of the abyss. Thank you, Miss Merkel. She was using the Greek, the original Greek, as she said abyss. King James renders the abyss as bottomless pit. And Mussolini was a type. He had 9.5 years to fulfill that type, same as Napoleon had 9.5 years of reign. And now we're looking for the other. He'll have 3.5 years. We don't know who that other one is yet, but we know he may be the heir of one of the former world-ruling emperors under the Holy Roman Empire, and we're watching those heirs. And we're watching for the signs that tell us whoever it's going to be, boom, there he is. He's risen out of the abyss once again. You know, for a beast that was and is not and yet is. Now it is not because and yet is because it didn't totally die. It just got wounded and was sleeping dormant in the abyss. And he arose out with Mussolini for 9.5 years, made a small splash. We're still suffering from that small splash with Hitler under Mussolini. And then it's back in Mussolini after he was shot on April 28, 1945, and then a little bit later Hitler kills himself in 1945. The beast went back into the abyss, wounded, lying dormant, healing, and being made ready to ascend, and to ascend this time in a much, as you're going to see in this feast film. We're going to do a flashback to yesterday's feast film and show the portion where Mr. Armstrong is talking about the destruction that's going to come in this next round of World War, once that beast ascends in the full form of perdition, the big whammy version, what's really being said The duality of it is the latter fulfillment of it. That's about to happen with the seventh king about to rise out of there. But God had, first of all, a man come and give a warning. And we'll see the scripture that relates to how he has to go before kings and explain how that is before the 42 months, the 1,260 days, the time and times and half a time, the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. There had to be a warning going to the kings. And there may be a small one again, and the two witnesses will help do that during the 42 months. But you'll see the very special role Mr. Armstrong had. Many of the truths that we have, God gave them to us through him. And so when he says, remember where you received it and how, we're paying some honor to that today as we see the multitude of the fruits of the work God did through Mr. Armstrong as we watch this 1985 feast film.
The following is a Worldwide Church of God presentation. In August 1914, Europe erupted in war. For 4 terrible years, the great powers battled each other until they reached a standstill in the fields of France and Belgium. When the conflict was over and the armistice signed, a generation of young men had been slaughtered. Weapons had become so powerful, the destruction so complete. Surely civilization could not survive another war like this. This had to be the war to end all wars. Following the armistice, King Albert I of Belgium visited a battlefield in his shattered kingdom. Appalled by the scenes of ruin and slaughter, the king ordered an iron shell casing found on the battlefield to be cast into 4 watch cases. He intended to present the watches to the 4 individuals who he felt had made the most significant contribution to peace. One watch went to Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, head of the Allied Supreme Command. Another was given to General John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force. The 3rd watch was presented to France's Premier, Georges Clemenceau, for his inspiring leadership in the dark days of war. But King Albert did not find anyone qualified to receive the 4th watch. When King Albert died, it was passed on to his son, King Leopold III. In 1970, half a century after the end of World War I, King Leopold presented this 4th watch to Herbert W. Armstrong. In accepting it, Mr. Armstrong said, "I feel it was the highest honor the king could have paid anyone. Whatever contribution to world peace I may be making is not through war, but through education, teaching millions worldwide the way to peace." The 20th century has been a time of paradox, the most progressive and yet the most destructive decades in all history. Great advances have been made in science, engineering, architecture, medicine. Knowledge has exploded in nearly every field of human endeavor. And yet mankind is still losing the battle against the age-old curses of poverty, ignorance, superstition, and war. A few men have cavorted in triumph in the dust of the moon, but millions still languish in despair in the dust of the earth. Even as we forge ahead with brilliant progress and incredible inventions, we edge ever closer to a disaster which would make the earth once more without form and void. Is this how it will end? This century of great advancement?
And now the weapons exist for the first time in all history when they can snuff out every life of every man, woman, and child on this earth. They can just blast all humanity off the earth until not one of us would be left alive. If some idiot, and he would be an idiot, sets off the nuclear explosion, and today you know that several nations, several smaller nations, have nuclear weapons. And they could start it, and it would go to Russia and the United States and the big nations, and finally there wouldn't be any humanity left. Most of us are asleep, and we don't realize what's going on all over the world. I am a voice crying out in the wilderness, the Babylon of religious confusion, of educational chaos and materialism, of political confusion and trouble in the governments of the world, all arming to have war and more war, in a society that is bankrupt, in an economic system that is bankrupt, in that kind of a system. And I'm here to bring you the truth. So I ask you to open your ears and to listen, because you don't hear this from any other voice. Why do we have these?
Herbert Armstrong has been a voice of sanity in these decades of confusion.
World leaders have said.
He has traveled the world, meeting heads of state of many nations. He has met the only two ruling emperors since the end of World War I, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia and Emperor Hirohito of Japan. He has also met with presidents and prime ministers of many nations: the United Kingdom, Kenya, India, Israel, the Philippines, and Indonesia. He has also met all 7 prime ministers of Japan since 1970. Mr. Armstrong explains the true cause of mankind's troubles. Why, in spite of the great progress in physical knowledge, the nations of the world cannot find the way to lasting peace.
I've been coming to Japan now for many years. I'm a little hoarse tonight. You'll have to excuse me. I was speaking quite a while last night to many readers of our magazine, The Plain Truth, and I find that I'm a little hoarse. But as I was telling them last night, I have seen so many things happen in this world in the almost 90 years that I have lived. I have seen miraculous things happen. I have seen awesome progress. But also I have seen appalling troubles and evils happening in the world, and it is becoming worse all the time. I have to ask why. Why the paradox of awesome progress and awesome accomplishments, sending men to the moon and back, jet plane travel, the miracle of television, the many things that we have today, and still so many troubles and so much sorrow and sickness all over the world.
Mr. Armstrong has carried a message of warning and of hope to leaders in every corner of the world. His relentless efforts to explain the true meaning behind world conditions have earned him the title Unofficial Ambassador for World Peace. In the remote Himalayan kingdom of Nepal, two great Eastern religions coexist. It is the only Hindu kingdom in the world, as well as the birthplace of Buddhism. In the Kathmandu Valley, hundreds of gods are an age-old testimony to the dominant role religion plays in the people's way of life.
It has given me a great honor and privilege to introduce such a great man who is visiting our country. A person like Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. This gentleman, for a moment all his life, has one ambition and one thought, and that is peace in the world. There should be peace, no war.
They've called me an unofficial ambassador for world peace, and so I am. But let me say that there has to be a reason why we don't have peace. And you cannot have peace until there is something that will cause that peace. And there has to be a reason why something has caused us to have just the opposite of peace in this world today. And I'm afraid so many don't understand that. Now, in the world today, there are many different ideologies and philosophies and religions, and everybody seems to think that their own, of course, is the right one and the only one that is true and correct. And I did not come to bring any religion or philosophy or ideology, but just to state a few facts that are facts. We do not have peace and will not have peace until human nature has been changed.
Herbert W. Armstrong is able to survey the 20th century from a unique perspective. In his long life, he has seen the coming of the inventions that have made possible the modern age: the airplane, radio and television, the computer, space travel. Inventions that have changed our world, but not our thinking. In his lifetime, there have been two major attempts by the nations to bring about world peace. After World War I, the victors formed the League of Nations. Hopes were high that the world's governments could now act collectively to prevent war. But the League failed. It was unable to restrain the aggression by the fascist dictators in the 1930s. In June 1945, Mr. Armstrong, as an accredited press representative, was present at the signing of the United Nations Charter at Herbst Theater in San Francisco. The United Nations was a sincere effort to preserve the peace by a world tired of war. But the nations have continued to fight, oblivious to the only way to halt the endless cycles of death and destruction.
Now, I'm not going out to crusade and just stop all wars. I can't do that. I have enough sense to know that I can never do that. And there is no man on earth who can. It is only the great Creator who can, and it's because we do not rely on the Creator for the knowledge of how to live and how to do, and because we just look to ourselves, that we find we're helpless before our problems. The world does not know how to live. because it does not rely on the great Creator that is above all the gods and above all that is worshipped, above all of the ideas of human beings. But most human beings know nothing of that God. I can just tell you that
Mr. Armstrong is an ambassador from a kingdom that is not of this world, with a message about government,
he is going to
law, war and peace, and the plan of God. That plan and the course of events that have led to our dangerous modern world were outlined long ago in the much misunderstood prophecies of the Bible. Over 4,000 years ago, God made a promise to the faithful patriarch Abraham. Because Abraham had obeyed him, God would raise up from him a chosen people who would become a model nation. If they would be faithful and obey God, he would bless them above all the nations of the earth. God kept his promise. He brought the descendants of Abraham's grandson Israel out of slavery in Egypt and revealed to them a way of life, 10 great commandments, and laws, statutes, and judgments that would allow them to live in peace and safety in the promised land. The chosen people rose to the peak of their power and influence in the days of King Solomon. But after his death, they split into two, a northern kingdom of Israel, dominated by the descendants of Israel's son Joseph, and the southern kingdom of Judah. And they forgot their God. The northern kingdom continued for 2.5 centuries, sinking ever further into idolatry, until in the 8th century BC, God allowed his people to be conquered and taken into captivity by the armies of the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom struggled on for 120 more years, but eventually, ignoring the warnings of the great prophets, Judah suffered the same fate. In 585 BC, Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar, and the inhabitants of Judah were led into exile. Jerusalem was in ruins, and the promised land laid waste. It seemed as if the promise had been broken. But God had not forgotten his people or his plan. In Babylon, a young Jewish captive, Daniel, is summoned before Nebuchadnezzar to interpret a strange dream that had troubled the Babylonian emperor.
You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
Then Daniel explained the meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.
In one startling prophecy, God had outlined the course of world events for thousands of years into the future. During the next few years, God continued to give Daniel details of the 4 great empires that would dominate history. After a startling dream, Daniel awoke to write down the frightening revelation.
I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns.
Daniel laid a foundation, but he was not given full understanding. That would not come until many centuries had passed, and the world was in the tumultuous age spoken of in prophecy as the time of the end. When that time came, God would raise up another servant who would take a message to all the world on the brink of destruction.
And God has sent me to the kings and to the tops of nations even. And this gospel of the kingdom is going to all the world. Now what is going to happen? The hydrogen bomb has come. And you will read back in Ezekiel, the 6th chapter, that all of the great cities are going to be leveled and destroyed. I'm telling you that a time more terrifying than anything that ever happened is soon going to happen in this world. It's time we wake up. It's time we get our eyes open. We have lost God. We have forgotten God. And God is going to step in. Satan is ruling this dark world, and it's an unhappy world. And God has sent me to preach this gospel. The other ministers, the other churches are not preaching that gospel of Jesus Christ. They preach about Christ, but they don't preach his message. They preach about the messenger, but they don't preach the messenger's message. They ask Christ what will be the end of the world. The end of the world is when this gospel of the kingdom is preached, and you are seeing it. You're seeing me here, I'm preaching it.
This work that has grown into international scope began in 1934. The 30s were difficult times. The United States and Europe were in the grip of the Great Depression. In Germany, a madman had begun to lead his nation down the road to ruin. In 1934, although most did not recognize it, the world was entering the time of the end. Far from the center of turmoil, in the quiet Willamette Valley of western Oregon, God was leading Herbert W. Armstrong to understand the significance of these times. In his autobiography, Mr. Armstrong tells how his eyes were opened to see that the prophecies of the Bible had an urgent message for the modern world. Herbert W. Armstrong was being prepared for a vitally important mission. When God uses human instruments to do his work, things start small. To begin with, there was just Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong and a group of humble co-workers. But God was beginning to lay the foundation for a powerful last witness to the nations of the world. Using the experience gained in business, Mr. Armstrong organized the work into a three-point plan: a weekly radio program, a monthly magazine, and a continuing series of personal lectures and campaigns. The World Tomorrow grew from one program on a 100-watt station to a radio and television program that is now heard and seen on hundreds of stations around the world. From an even humbler beginning, the plain truth has steadily increased in quality and circulation until today it reaches into nearly every country on earth in many languages with a readership of millions. The third part of the three-point plan also began small. Mr. Armstrong held meetings in rented halls in the towns and villages of the Willamette Valley. As the work grew, he planned campaigns in other parts of the United States and eventually overseas. But God had even bigger plans for this part of the three-point plan. The turning point came in 1968. As the world moved closer to its date with destiny, God thrust his servant into the international arena. Like so many other major advances in God's work, it began with a series of apparent coincidences.
It will be 20 years this year that we have been associated with Herr and Frau Hennig. We got to know them years ago at Bonn because of a visit of Mr. Manescu, who was the foreign minister of Romania. And something very interesting developed later, and maybe Frau Hennig would like to tell us that story.
Yes, we were looking for a particular camera. I don't quite remember which type, but in any available in Germany, and Mr. Schnee pointed out that maybe in Belgium or America. Anyway, we drove to Belgium because we had an acquaintance there who has a wholesale camera business. And we asked him, and he told us that he thought he could get this camera for us. Both we and Mr. Schnee wanted one. And then we stayed on a while until we were able to get a camera. And Herr Roland invited us to join him for a cup of coffee in his private apartment upstairs. Upon that occasion, something very special happened. Maybe you would like to tell that, Mr. Schnee.
Yes. Herr Roland, during this visit, handed me a stack of photographs. And I was looking at these photographs, and as coincidence would have it, just before this, Dr. Hay had given me the job of looking for color pictures because the Plain Truth magazine had just gone to full color. And we were desperate to get all kinds of color pictures. So I thought, well, these pictures would be wonderful. There were so many really good shots from all over the world. And I said to Herr Roland when he came back into the room, we would certainly like to buy some of these pictures for our magazines. And he sort of smiled knowingly and shook his head. He said, no. He said, you won't be able to buy these pictures. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, these were taken by King Leopold of Belgium. And he said, one thing, a king could not get involved in a commercial venture. But secondly, he said, anyway, he uses all of his photos for his own publications. And I remember saying, well, I still mean what I say. we could use these pictures for our publications. And I had almost forgotten about the incident when about a week or 10 days later, suddenly the telephone rang. And Herr Roland was on the other side, quite excited. Herr Schnee, I've just come from the king. And the king says that he wants to meet you and talk to you about his photographs. And he would be willing to sell them to Ambassador College. But he said, before you come, could you bring something over so that I could go to the king and explain to him what Ambassador College is, the Plain Truth magazine, and who this man Herbert Armstrong is? And I said, certainly, I'll come right over tomorrow. And when I went, this time I took the 1966 envoy with me. Now this was in 1968. And the biggest envoy that had appeared to that time was this 1966 issue. And I took this envoy and I went through it page by page with Herr Roland and described to him what Ambassador College is and the work of God and Mr. Armstrong and what our goals are, what we hope to accomplish and so on. And the next day, Herr Roland then went to the king and explained the envoy to him as good as he could after I had shown him the envoy. Then Herr Roland came back to me, and Herr Roland said, after seeing the envoy, the king would rather meet Mr. Armstrong. Of course, my vanity wasn't hurt, except maybe a little. But he said, King Leopold wants to meet the man that has raised up this fine college. And so I had a tiger by the tail now, because I had not even told Mr. Armstrong anything of what had gone before. So I called him up. He happened to be in England at the time. And I remember my opening sentence was, I hope I haven't done anything wrong, Mr. Armstrong. And he said, oh, what have you been into now? And I said, well, Mr. Armstrong, we have an invitation for you to meet King Leopold. And then I went on to explain how it all came about, and he said, well, you haven't done anything wrong. But he said, I'm not sure I'm going to go. I'm going to look into it first. And then about a week later he said, well, I've got all the facts. And he said, I've decided to go, so you can tell King Leopold we would be happy to accept his invitation. It was quite a thrill to go with Mr. Armstrong into the king's palace and to be received by his servants. We were ushered into a waiting room, and then within a few minutes we were brought into a large drawing room. I remember the king sitting at a small coffee table with chairs of padded furniture, very elegant. The king motioned us to come near and greeted us, shook hands, and asked us to sit down. And then quite a shock came, because the opening sentence that the king spoke was, Mr. Armstrong, why have you come to see me? And I thought, well, ghastly, doesn't he know he has invited him? What have I gotten Mr. Armstrong into? But Mr. Armstrong, very calm and collected, just said, well, I understand that you've had a look at our 1966 envoy describing Ambassador College, and that Herr Schnee has shown that we have an interest in your color photographs, and that you have actually invited me to come here. And the king said, yes, that's right. And a few more sentences were exchanged, and it seemed a very short while, and the king said, well, let's go down to my hobby room and let's look at some of my favorite slides. And I remember he showed us about 125 color slides, again from all over the world. And of course Mr. Armstrong was really elated to think that we could have such photographs for the Plain Truth magazine. And it was soon after this first visit that Mr. Armstrong made to King Leopold that he was invited back again. And Herr Roland told us later that it was a rare thing that a guest would be invited on the second visit already to meet the family and to have dinner with the family. Finally, I remember King Leopold visiting our college in Bricket Wood in England, and then later visiting the college at Pasadena and speaking to the student body And of course, a very deep friendship developed. And then from there, the King Leopold, introduced Mr. Armstrong to other personages in high office. And Mr. Armstrong began visiting leaders all over the world. And it's so hard to believe now, but you can see that God always provides the right people at the right time. Just because of a camera we needed, we went to Belgium and we met Herr Roland, and just because of this remark that I made about these photographs that Herr Roland handed me, and because of the need of them for the Plain Truth magazine, we saw this whole thing develop into Mr. Armstrong going to leaders all over the world as an ambassador for world peace.
Since that first meeting in 1968, God has brought Mr. Armstrong before many of the world's most powerful and influential men and women. The walls of Mr. Armstrong's study in Pasadena are lined with mementos of those visits, gifts from the leaders of great nations and small. Some are still in office. Others are no more, victims of old age, of political intrigue, or sometimes the assassin's bullet. Sincere leaders like Anwar Sadat of Egypt, whose dreams of peace were ahead of the violent times in which he lived.
Incidentally, Mr. President, I want to say one thing right straight from the heart. I respect and admire you more than I can tell you, because you have risked everything in an effort for peace. And your heart has to be in it, and it has to be genuine. And not many will do that. I meet heads of state all over the world, but I have not known one that would risk what you did of acquiring the enmity of the Arab world in order to have peace. Now that takes courage, and you have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I'm going to let the world know it, because I reach a part of the world.
Very good. Very good.
Less than a year later, Anwar el-Sadat lost his life for the peace he sought. Shortly after the assassination of President Sadat, Mr. Armstrong returned to Egypt.
I was out to the memorial yesterday where President Sadat lies buried. I did give a little salute, and I just said quietly, well, goodbye, my friend.
But leadership must continue, and the reins of government were passed on to the new Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak. During this trip, Mr. Armstrong met with the new leader of Egypt.
I'm not in politics. I'm an observer. I just look on. I represent God, Allah, and all people. Not any one nation, not any one religion, not any one government. But I'm a friend of all, and I work for peace among all nations. And that is a contribution to peace. And as I say, we are not going to be able to bring peace ourselves. It'll be brought to us.
In the cause of world peace, no region of the world is more crucial than the Middle East. This is the arena in which the fate of civilization will one day be settled. Mr. Armstrong has traveled often in this troubled area. He has kept friendly ties with leaders of both sides of the conflict, such as King Hussein of Jordan, President Suleiman Frangieh of Lebanon, Prime Minister Hedi Nouira of Tunisia, and Prime Ministers Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Menachem Begin of Israel. Focal point of the Middle East's troubles is Jerusalem, holy city for three of the world's great religions, and center of contention in the long struggle between the Arab and Israeli people. Mr. Armstrong travels frequently to this pivotal city.
Well, I think I've met every prime minister of Israel since 1968, and every president.
Well, I'm sure that all of them, including myself, appreciate very much what you are doing for this city, old and new, to excavate, to participate, and God bless you.
How do you foresee conditions here in the Middle East now, in the immediate future?
I think we have a chance to break through the wall of belligerence. It's a very complicated business, but after a very long interval, there is a chance, and I think it is for us responsible people not to miss it. Not to miss it.
Do you think that...
Mr. Armstrong discussed the problems that the Middle Eastern leaders face in their quest for peace, including the role of Israel's close neighbor, King Hussein of Jordan.
I think the king knows where he wants to arrive, but he didn't find yet a way to do so.
I know he would like to have peace with you.
I think so. Yes.
I think last time I saw him was 2 years ago, and Mr. Begin was prime minister. I said to King Hussein, I would like to bring Mr. Begin over here in my airplane and have you come out to the plane, and my crew and myself and all of us would leave and leave you two on the plane and get acquainted. I know Mr. Begin well enough. I believe he would be glad to do it. And I know you would too, Your Majesty, if. And he began to laugh and he says, yes, you're right, I would, if. But he would like to, if he could.
I think so, yes. I think that he has his eyes set on peace, but he has to negotiate many difficulties.
I hope you have the breakthrough that you spoke of.
We shall try very hard.
Thank you very much.
We owe it to our friends and to our posterity. We owe it. We shall try very hard.
Well, I can tell you this much. We're going to have more troubles all over the world. In the end, we're going to have world peace. It isn't going to come right away, though. And it isn't going to come easy.
Jerusalem is a city that has rarely known peace. Human passion and religious fervor ensure that prophecy must take its inevitable course. And in the hills and valleys that surround Jerusalem, civilization will be brought to its knees. But God's work can focus on the future, when Jerusalem will be the center for worldwide peace and cooperation. Through the Ambassador Foundation, Mr. Armstrong has worked with Jerusalem's leaders to provide centers where Jewish and Arab children can learn to live, play, and work in peace. It is a significant effort, showing in a practical way that peace can never come until a generation of children have been prepared for a way of life other than war. Mr. Armstrong worked with Mayor Teddy Kollek in supporting the children's playground in Liberty Bell Park that was established during America's bicentennial. In recognition of his contribution to the welfare of the city's people, Mayor Teddy Kollek presented Mr. Armstrong with a token of appreciation.
Yeah. Well, President Armstrong, all your life you have been a fighter of giant lies and of giant untruth. And as you regard yourself a descendant of David, and rightly so, here in the city of David, we would like to present you with this symbolic sculpture in silver and gold of David with his slingshot defeating Goliath. The stories of the Bible are better known to you than to anybody around this table. But here it assumes particular symbolism and particular content. And Mr. Ravid reminded us of the children storming you and appraising you for what you did there, or if it's the very recent contemporary history of helping ICCY with their daily programs. And I'm sure you'll continue with many of these things, but here we are mainly to thank you and proffer you this symbolic gift, which says it all just by looking at it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Armstrong then reminded his hosts of the key role that Jerusalem plays in world events, now and in the future.
Jerusalem is a city with a very remarkable history, more than almost any other city. The eternal God himself says that this city is destined to become the greatest city in the world and in fact in the whole universe. This city is someday going to be the capital of the universe, because this city is going to exist forever. It may still undergo some more changes, but it's going to endure. And you can't say that of any other city on earth.
Christ's apostles first preached the gospel to the people of Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago. Those first apostles traveled thousands of miles on foot, on horseback, and by sailing boat, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God throughout the Roman Empire. Today, the message is the same, but the end-time work has a means of transportation that makes it possible to travel more miles in one day than a lifetime of voyaging in the first century. The first airplane to be used by Mr. Armstrong was a Falcon fan jet. This was replaced by the larger and longer range Gulfstream II. The G-2 served the work faithfully for 14 years, logging more than 3 million miles. In 1983, it was decided to replace the G-2 with the similar but greatly improved Gulfstream III. The G-3 was built at the Gulfstream Aerospace Assembly Plant in Savannah, Georgia. Once the mainframe has been assembled, the thousands of parts that make up a modern jet aircraft are carefully installed. The aircraft's systems are thoroughly tested before it leaves the production line.
Roger, Gulfstream 417. Power levels to idle.
Levels and idle, Roger.
Okay, start your dry crank.
Right engine motoring over, combine flight utility coming up.
Roger, select landing gear up. Put landing gear up and lock. Observe hydraulic readings. as follows. Combine 3,000 pounds, utilities 0, flight 1,500.
Gear up, systems read as noted. Ready to proceed.
Aileron, rudder, and elevator operated while applying wheel brake, ground spoilers, and thrust reversers.
Be slow now.
With all systems functioning, the moment comes for the rollout. There are still many more hours of engine and flight tests to be completed. But eventually, it is time to add the finishing touches. In the paint shop, the distinctive Ambassador College color scheme is carefully applied. Meanwhile, in the cabinet shops, the interior fittings are being built. As the interior begins to take shape, Mr. Armstrong visits Savannah to personally inspect the progress on his new office in the sky. Everything must reflect the high standard that people around the world associate with Ambassador College and the work. The G3 can fly at 85% of the speed of sound, about 637 miles per hour. It can travel non-stop for 4,370 miles at an altitude of 40,000 feet. Cabin pressure is maintained at a comfortable 6,000 feet. With its advanced design and sophisticated equipment, the G3 is considered to be the finest medium-sized jet passenger plane in the world. On August 19, 1985, the new G3 was flown to the airstrip at the Ambassador College campus in Big Sandy to be delivered to Mr. Armstrong.
Brethren, I want to come out for just a moment here if I can find the right button. I hope you caught that point, that plane was flown in on August 19, 1995, and in the next few minutes, you're going to see how, even though that was only August, September, October, November, December of 1985, before Mr. Armstrong then died in the middle of January 1986, in those next 4 months, Mr. Armstrong traveled overseas. You're going to see how many kings and peoples he visited in the new plane in the very last few months of his life, and how significant that was. I just wanted to pop in and say that, make sure you're seeing the significance of how this expense and this plane was used so wonderfully in the very last few months of the apostles' life. Let's go right back to it.
Very impressive.
Yes, she's a beauty, isn't she? Looks just like the G2. This is 111 Alpha Charlie. Delivery of the G3 111 Alpha Charlie.
Yes, sir. All ready is all yours.
And so a powerful new tool began its years of service to the work of God.
Again, in the next few minutes, you're going to see how powerfully Mr. Armstrong was able to use it in the last 4.5 months of his life. But the narrator there, Art Gilmore, mentioned how this new plane would have years of service, and it did. It had a decade of service used by the new pastor general, in spite of the fact that he went apostate later. Look was laid before his feet had he remained faithful. He had all the benefits that God gave as a blessing to the fruit of the work he did through Mr. Armstrong. Let's go back and let's see in the last few months of Mr. Armstrong's life how wonderfully and fruitfully this asset, physical asset of the work of God, was used even in the last few months of Mr. Armstrong's life.
Home base for the G3 is Burbank Airport, 15 miles from Pasadena. The ground crew prepares it for an extended trip to South Asia and the Far East. Baggage and food are loaded aboard, and final preparations are made. After Mr. Armstrong and those traveling with him arrive, Captain Ken Hopke and co-captain Larry Dietrich make a final pre-flight check.
Autopilot, craft change.
Check. APU is Burbank clearance, Gulfstream 111 Alpha Charlie is ready for ATC clearance.
November 111 Alpha Charlie, you're cleared to the Honolulu Airport via the Canoga 5 departure. Fillmore transition. To Fillmore, then flight planned route. Maintain 7,000. Expect flight level 39er within 5 minutes after departure. Departure control frequency 124.6, squawk 0385.
Hey, ready for taxi.
Understand?
Clear right?
Want to make a right 270 on the top, my friend?
The G3 takes off from Burbank and heads out across the Pacific Ocean. Mr. Armstrong uses the many long hours of flying to catch up on essential writing.
I visit many heads of state all over the world. I probably have visited more heads of government in their own offices than any other man. And so often people ask me, well, what do I talk about? Do I preach Christ to them? Do I try to get them to accept Christ? I think it's about time we understand. If I went in with some message like that, will you give your heart to the Lord? I would be thrown out on my ear. In other nations, in foreign nations where they have different religions, they don't want some other religion coming in.
Yes, sir, it's right here.
I have to use a little more wisdom. What do I talk about? I talk about the conditions that they're confronted with. I talk about world conditions and problems that are far greater than they themselves are able to cope with. I talk about the cause of these conditions. I go as an ambassador, an unofficial ambassador for world peace. And they receive me as an ambassador for world peace. But I have to tell them why we don't have peace. I have to show them how peace is going to come and why we don't have it. Now, actually, the cause is the violation of God's law. Do I talk to them about God's law? Do I talk to them about sin? Of course I do, but I don't use those terms. I don't talk as a religious man. So I talk to them in language they understand. And so I talk about giving and about loving and being concerned for the welfare of others as well as yourself. And this world is built on the philosophy of get. Everyone wants to get for himself. And that's what's causing all of the troubles in the world. And you know, that makes sense to heads of state. They're practical men. They see these things about them all the time. And they begin to listen when I talk about those things. Do I talk about the kingdom of God? Yes, I do. And God is going to intervene. And sometimes I tell them that straight out. So many of them get the message, and they do understand.
After many hours of flying, the pilots prepare to land in Beijing, capital of the People's Republic of China.
Beijing Tower, November 111, Alpha Charlie for landing Beijing.
November 111, Alpha Charlie. You are clear to land runway 36. Surface wind is 350 at 10.
Roger, clear to land 11 Alpha Charlie.
Mr. Armstrong was met by an official delegation from the Soon Ching Ling Foundation and the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. Later that day, at a reception, Mr. Armstrong was welcomed by Madame Kang Kijing, who is considered to be China's First Lady. A key event in Mr. Armstrong's 6-day visit was a meeting with China's most prominent leader, Deng Xiaoping, in the Great Hall of the People. China is undertaking a sweeping modernization program. Great progress has been made in this huge country in the last 35 years, but China still has a long way to go in achieving success and prosperity for her vast population. Deng Xiaoping has been frank in admitting that mistakes have been made, and under his leadership, China is making important changes as they prepare for the last decade of the 20th century and beyond.
Just across the way.
Mr. Armstrong is also frank in telling his Chinese hosts the root cause of humanity's problems, and the ultimate change in direction that must be made before any nation can have lasting peace.
I would just like to say that we're living in a world of contrasts, a world of awesome progress, advancement in technology, in engineering, in production of every kind, and yet at the same time, a world that is filled with evils, and the evils are multiplying more rapidly than the progress. Why do we live in such a world? Why cannot we solve all of the problems? Why cannot we have world peace? I can answer in just 2 words: human nature.
我的回答就是2个字，这就是人性。
Human nature. Human nature always seeks to get and to take, but has no concern for the good of others. If we're going to have real world peace, we will have to overcome that tendency of human nature.
An important contribution towards peace is to teach tomorrow's leaders the way of cooperation and service. China has hundreds of millions of children. As chairman of the Ambassador Foundation, Mr. Armstrong has established a working relationship with Chinese organizations dedicated to serving youth. Several months before Mr. Armstrong's visit to China, the Ambassador Foundation sponsored children from the Children's Palace in Shanghai on a tour of several American cities. They had stayed on the Ambassador campus and visited with Mr. Armstrong at his home. During his trip to China, Mr. Armstrong visited the Shanghai Children's Palace, where talented children are taught a variety of cultural skills. The reunion with his Chinese grandchildren was a highlight of a busy week. At a banquet in Shanghai's Jinjiang Club, Mr. Armstrong delivered a parting address.
The world is now threatened with nuclear war, and all of the experts admit that if a nuclear war starts, it can never be stopped.
现在世界上面临着核战争的威胁，专家们都认为，一旦核战争爆发了，就无法停止这样的战争的。
And if a nuclear war is not stopped, It would erase all human beings off this earth. An important business magazine in the United States carried an editorial which said it would seem that the only hope of humanity now lies in the sudden appearance and intervention of a strong hand from someplace. The editor who wrote that was referring to the Creator God who created all mankind. And I tell you tonight, by his authority, that he will intervene and will save humanity, and we will have world peace.
我今天晚上想告诉你们，只有上帝的权威才能加以干预，才能给世界带来和平。
But when the great Creator does intervene and rule all nations on the earth, he is going to begin teaching us peace by working with the little children.
After leaving China, Mr. Armstrong and his party traveled on to several other Asian countries. He was also invited to visit the leaders of the beautiful but troubled island of Sri Lanka, located in the Indian Ocean off the southern tip of India. Sri Lanka should be a blessed land. With its small population and abundant resources, the nation has been able to avoid some of the problems that other nations in this poverty-stricken region must struggle against. Sri Lanka has embarked on an ambitious development scheme to harness the waters of the nation's largest river and open up thousands of acres of arid land for settlement and cultivation. Mr. Armstrong was asked by the Sri Lankans to view this vast project now in the final stages of completion.
Sri Lanka is the only developing.
Later, he discussed Sri Lanka's development with President Julius Jayawardena. The President explained that in spite of spectacular progress, Sri Lanka is going through a time of trouble. Separatists, seeking their own state in the north, have engaged in several acts of terrorism. Hundreds have been killed and wounded, and the calm of this tropical island paradise has been shattered. The Sri Lankans have learned that material development of itself does not bring peace. Man can find a way to control the power of mighty rivers, but he cannot stop the tide of anger, resentment, and contention that flows from human hearts. In a lively press conference with Sri Lankan radio, TV, and newspaper reporters, Mr. Armstrong explained why the nation could not find peace.
Well, all our problems are caused by human nature. And human nature is essentially selfish. Now, I can explain those things, and I can say that it comes from self-interest, from a spirit of competition, always from the point of view of the interest of oneself or one's party or one's race or one's religion or whatever one is a member of. But we're living in a competitive world. We're living in a world that is based fundamentally on the philosophy of get. And so we still do not have peace because people do not know the way to peace. The way to peace is having concern for your fellow man. The way to peace is love. The way to peace is cooperation and helping one another and having a loving concern for the good of other people. And that gets into human nature. Now, I cannot change human nature. I can talk about it and I can explain and I can give the reason. But every one of you must make up your own mind what you're going to do. I can't make up your mind for you. And that's the same with everybody else on earth. I can't make up the minds of other people. I can only make up my mind what I want to do. But I can explain the truth and the cause of wars and the way to world peace. And it will not come until mankind comes to have love for his neighbor. And today, man doesn't love his neighbor. Nation doesn't love other nations. They love their own nation. And so we have competition, and that leads to, often, to war. And individuals come to what you're having here right now, the kind of violence has come into terrorism. And terrorism comes in the same way as war, from a wrong attitude of mind, a wrong desire of just selfishness and of opposition toward other people and wanting to use force of some kind to have your own way against other people. I don't have a magic wand. I can't wave a magic wand and just say the world has peace. You can't bring it about that way. I have to look at the facts as they are. And the facts are human nature.
But I feel what you have just said is only philosophy and does not offer any solution to our problems. How will that produce peace now?
It won't produce peace now. I'm just telling you the facts, that what will produce peace. And I say to you that we human beings are not going to produce peace. I think that all religions, at least, know that there is a higher power. Many of them don't know what that higher power is. They don't have it defined, perhaps, because they don't know. But there is a higher power, and that higher power is going to have to come and bring us peace. We're not going to bring peace, but the great Creator, God, is going to have to intervene and bring us peace if he has to force it upon us. And that's the way peace is finally going to come.
As for Sri Lanka, we have prayed to God to solve our ethnic problem. But I don't think even God can promote peace in this country.
I say to you that God could intervene right now. But that is not his will to do that, and he is not, I can tell you that, he is not going to intervene right now. He's going to let us learn some lessons. Human beings do not know that they should love their fellow man. And so we go about loving our own selves instead of our fellow man. And God is going to let us punish ourselves and bring about wars and kill so many people. It will come to the place where we would destroy every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. The weapons of mass destruction now exist. The United States has them. The Soviet Union has them. France has them. China has them. Other nations are beginning to have nuclear weapons. And a nuclear war could erase all human life from this earth. And conditions are going to come, and men are going to go on fighting one another, and men are going to go on. I can't change their minds, and no other man can change their minds. And men are going to have to learn that lesson. They're going to come to the place where they would destroy the last man and woman and child on earth. Then the supreme God is going to intervene before that happens.
And he is not going to intervene until we learn our lesson. Humanity won't learn. I can tell you the way to peace, but you won't believe me. You men right here won't believe me. The world won't believe me. And I can't bring peace unless you would believe me, and you won't. I'm speaking very plainly. I represent that higher power. And I know what he proposes. And I know what he is going to do. And he won't do it until we have punished ourselves to the place where we're willing to submit to him. The trouble is, neither side in this problem that you're having here right now is willing to submit to that higher power. And as long as you won't, you're going to fight and have trouble. And we're going to have to come to the place where we have to rely on him to do it for us.
In Colombo, the capital city, Mr. Armstrong explained the purpose of the Ambassador Foundation to Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranasinghe Premadasa.
I'm sure you understand that the Ambassador Foundation is not religious.
I do.
It's neither political nor religious. It's separate. It is supported by the church.
Yes.
But it is not religious in itself at all. And even the church is not proselyting and is not seeking members. And so we have nothing to gain. But perhaps we may have something to give.
Right. And the more you give, you gain.
That's right. Well, as has been said, it's more blessed to give than to receive.
That is so.
And I find that is actually true.
If you endeavor to gain, you won't get anything.
I think that's the basis of the trouble in the world.
Right.
The people in the world are all trying to gain and to get.
Greed.
And not to share or to give. But sharing and giving is by far better.
That's right.
And will lead to peace instead of troubles. If people had more concern for others than themselves, and we weren't competitive, but we were cooperative and helpful to one another, we'd have peace.
We are very thankful to you for taking time off to visit our country and discuss matters with us, and for the great service you are rendering to mankind.
After leaving Sri Lanka, the G3 flew across the Bay of Bengal to Thailand.
And brethren, we'll pick up there tomorrow with Mr. Armstrong's visit to the land part of Thailand. We're out of time for today for this live stream for the fourth day. Okay, all right, brethren. Like I said, I picked that up from a video that I used in 2017. And we are going to stop there at this point where Mr. Armstrong is next going on to Thailand. We'll pick that up tomorrow because what I'd like to do is pick up the last part of yesterday's feast film where Mr. Armstrong was explaining that what we're doing now in this Feast of Tabernacles. Oh, I had our volume a little low. Hope you can hear me better now. All right, we stopped. Let me just repeat that mention I made, that we stopped where we did as Mr. Armstrong is about to go visit Thailand on that new G3. All this occurring in the last 4.5 months of Mr. Armstrong's life, at the end of 1985. And Mr. Armstrong died mid-January, January 16, 1986. Got this airplane delivered on August 19, 1995. I'm sorry, 1985. On August 19, 1985, the G3 was delivered. 5 months later, September, October, November, December, January. 5 months later, Mr. Armstrong dies on almost 5 months later, on January 16, 1986. But during those 4 months, he really visited kings and priests royally. We'll pick up with his visit to Thailand next. But now we're cutting back to a few excerpts from yesterday, where Mr. Armstrong had mentioned that when Jesus Christ returns, where some of us have maybe been thinking, wow, all right, the millennium, everything perfect. And as he says, some of you thought, hocus pocus, Christ returns, everything rosy-dozy after that. No. As Mr. Armstrong himself explains, as we go to this in a moment, as he explains, now this is him speaking in 1984, a year before, as he explains in this excerpt we're taking now that we showed yesterday. He said, when Christ returns and the millennium begins, Christ has ushered in the kingdom of God. It's not going to be a piece of cake. It's not going to be hocus pocus. It's going to be at least 3 generations. That's at least 60 years, depending on how long you determine a generation. And he said at least before things are cleaned up and nifty neat and all that. Let's go to this. Pick him up right there from 1984. Hopefully I've got some nice surprises for you tomorrow on the 5th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. We're now... All right, hang on. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on a second. I used the wrong button to start that, and I restarted what we were... I'm sorry, I used the wrong button to restart that, and that audio was coming from where we're going to pick up tomorrow. Now, let's use this button to get Mr. Armstrong going.
And I see the handwriting on the wall, and I see the way things are going in the world. And we haven't got much time. And the big job, once we've gone through this crisis, and Jesus Christ comes as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and we start the world tomorrow, a new world, and this world is dead and gone. There are many people who are going to survive all of the troubles of the Great Tribulation, and they will have children. And I can see that it's going to take not less than 3 whole generations before we can have world peace. Even after Christ comes, many of you seem to think that we'll have world peace just hocus pocus as soon as Christ comes. It isn't going to be that easy. Something has to cause it. People have to change the way they live before we have world peace, because it's the way people live that's causing all of the trouble today.
And so we must teach our children a different way of life. In the French province of Lorraine, near the little town of Morin, 80 children and teenagers from several European countries enjoy a summer education program, French style. The beautiful countryside of Lorraine is a sobering reminder of the need to prepare for a different world. For in these green fields on the border of France and Germany, Europe's great armies have clashed across the centuries. The Kaiser drilled and paraded his troops here. Then he led them into war, and a generation of young men were slaughtered. After the First World War, the territory was given to France. The French built a formidable barrier, the Maginot Line, to protect their frontiers forever against the enemy. But to no avail. Adolf Hitler promised his people 1,000 years of national greatness as he taught the children the arts of war and sent them to fight his battles. The Nazi legions devastated Europe for 4.5 terrible years before they were pushed back and destroyed by the combined armies of the wartime Allies. Only a few miles from the campsite at Morange is the war cemetery of Saint-Avant. Thousands of American soldiers are buried here. Most were young men, little more than teenagers, victims of a world that did not know the way of peace. It is sobering for the young YOU members to visit this cemetery. No greater contrast could be drawn between the ways of a world held captive by Satan and the way of life that comes from God. Satan's world has brought 6,000 years of misery and death. God offers life, abundant life in the world tomorrow, where no one will live in fear, and no nation will ever have to send its young men off to war again.
All right, brethren. Whoa, brethren, we're going to pause right there just for a moment and go right back to it, because there was a point being made that the great contrast between, and what's going to happen between now and Christ's return is going to be the next major event in prophecy. And this explosion kind of pictures what's going to happen in the next major event. Mr. Armstrong said that would be the opening of the fifth seal, and the fifth seal opens with round 3 of World War, and the beast power doing a blitzkrieg, a German word for like blitzkrieg, lightning strike. Lightning often seems like it comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden, boom, it hits here, and boom, it hits over there. Suddenly, and with great power behind it. And that's what the Germans, having realized how they lost the last round of war, as they put it, they didn't lost the last battle. They didn't say lost the war altogether. We just lost this round, this battle. And we see what we did wrong during this battle. We got on too many fronts. We let the superpowers, we were fighting other fronts while the superpowers got involved. What we've got to do is knock the superpowers out first. That'll be a fulfillment of Ezekiel chapter 6 and verse 6 that Mr. Armstrong made some reference to in both yesterday and today. And all your cities being laid waste. And that's how they plan on starting round 3 of World War, like a blitzkrieg, lightning bolt, all of a sudden out of where, not totally unexpected, boom, and with great power, suddenly, wham, all of the cities of the United Kingdom, later that same day or the next day, all of the cities of the United States laid waste. And then, round 3 of World War, where the beast takes over everything without superpowers there to inhibit him from doing so. Well, oh, Russia, what about the great superpower of Russia against the beast? Well, it's probably going to be the very same missiles that the Russian President Putin has talked about 2 years in a row now in his address to the nation of Russia, saying that we have 130 stealth missiles with hydrogen bombs on each one of them that no present or future defense system can inhibit from getting to its target. It's stealth. It's not radar detectable until it's gotten where it needs to go. No present or future defense system can defend against it, and it's probably those. And not only did the Russian president say he had 130 pointed at American cities, but he has more that are pointed at each of the major military strategic command posts of the United States. So the beast will probably take those from Russia just before the Blitzkrieg and use those, the missiles of Russia against the cities of the UK and the United States, the modern-day descendants of Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Boom! Now that's the next major event in prophecy. That comes between now and when Christ returns to usher in and restore God's kingdom that we're picturing during this feast. But the beginning of the feast, the first 60 years or so, first few days of the feast, even after Christ returns and ushers in and restores, he's bringing with him 7 vials, an angel with 7 vials, that when he pours them out, those are the 7 last plagues. That's the first part of the millennium, the pouring out of the 7 last plagues. Now, all right, wait a second. I realize that's going to have just happened. If we look at the holy days, Christ returns on the holy day that was the first day of this month, pictured by the first day of this month, the Feast of Trumpets. Then 9 days later, on the 10th day of this month, he puts away the devil. All right, when he returns on that first day, he's beginning to pour out those 7 last vials, those 7 last plagues, those vials of 7 last plagues. Then he puts away Satan. The next holy day, Day of Day of Atonement. And then 5 days later, when this feast begins with the first day of Tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles, millennium begins. But it's going to take the first 60 years to clean up the mess from everything, including the third woe, the pouring out of the 7 last plagues, and the Battle of Armageddon, that's going to have left this world looking like the kind of mess that we're about to see in the rest of this video. Let's go back to it now.
One great conflict still lies ahead for the human race, a war in which terrible weapons will be used. So great will be this war, so devastating the power that will be unleashed, that unless God intervenes, no flesh would be saved alive. But God will intervene and bring the dazed survivors into the world tomorrow to begin a new way of life. What kind of a world will they inherit? Once lush farmlands will have become barren wastelands. Forests will be destroyed. Transportation links will be in ruins, and communication networks shattered. Lakes and rivers will be polluted. Food will be in short supply, and the air may be polluted from the dust and debris of nuclear war. There will be millions of widows and orphans in need of help, wounded in need of healing. This world's great cities will lie in ruins and their industries destroyed. The rubble must be cleared and the waste places rebuilt into sparkling, clean cities that are exciting to visit and a pleasure to live in.
All right, brethren, he's explaining now what we're going to be facing at the very beginning of what this Feast of Tabernacles pictures. Hey, and there's little kids. We got to become like little kids to be able to enter that.
It will at last be a world that is safe for children. We are on the threshold of a new world when the knowledge of God's way of peace will cover the earth as the seas cover the ocean beds. The men, women, and children that God has chosen must learn that way. Parents and children that work together now will be the ones who are ready to teach in the world tomorrow.
All right, brother, we're over time, so listen, we'll pick up with some singing mañana, tomorrow, and we'll pick up from where we left off right here with what we're picturing. This wonderful world tomorrow that this time of the Feast of Tabernacles is the picture. But in real life, we're in between now and the opening of the 5th seal And even when we get to the start of the seventh trump in the seventh seal, after Christ returns, pours out the third woe, the seven plagues, and then puts away Satan, and then begins the Feast of Tabernacles millennium period, and we've got to clean up when we're in the process of learning now how to be teachers in that world. So we got a lot to learn, and we're going to cover a lot of that. Beginning tomorrow, we're going to start going into some basics that we should be sure we have before we get to what this time of Feast of Tabernacles pictures. And really enjoy this feast. Now get out there and eat some good food, whatever you're lusting for. A lot of states you can still go out to a restaurant. Here in Alabama, you got to keep every other table open. You can't sit right next to another group of people. That table's got to be blank. But at least here you can go to restaurants and fellowship with brethren. You have to wear your mask in, but you can take them off after you're in there for eating. And, keep a little social spacing. Don't be sitting in somebody else's lap while you eat. Of course, you wouldn't do that anyway. But enjoy this feast, but let's be thinking on the spiritual meaning, the deep spiritual meaning behind this. And let's be thinking on some things we're going to talk about, compromises to the truth that should not be happening, and how to determine whether your minister you voluntarily submitted to is holding fast, or, hey, wait a minute, Mr. Minister, you've trampled out on grounds that you don't have the authority to do. You are not an apostle. Only an apostle can change doctrine. And I know Mr. Armstrong died, but so did Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all the apostles and all the prophets. And yet God's Word and the truth of the Word lives on, and the truth of the doctrines God gave us through Mr. Armstrong live on in spite of some ministers compromising. We'll talk about that during the rest of the feast. Be sure to come back here. Join us on cogtv.org. Find us on Facebook Live Sabbath Service page. Find us on YouTube Live Sabbath Service channel. And best place to check is cogtv.org. Hit the archive video tab, and you can find our last video stream. We'll keep you in touch with where we are, just in case, things change. Things can close down. Our president has tested, and his wife have tested positive on the coronavirus, and we want to be praying for him. Ask God to heal him for the good he's trying to do for this country, and for an example, and to help us learn from that. Just, is this coronavirus a serious quarantine ourselves situation, or is it like cancer? You get it for a while, the body heals itself, as long as you don't get all scared too much by a doctor, and then let them put you through three things that, if you live through that, you would have probably much more have lived through the cancer anyway, in many cases, if you had just weathered it. And then if you ask God to heal you, and you have the faith. Mr. Armstrong pointed out, if you're going to put your trust in doctors, you better do everything that doctor says. But if you're putting your trust in God, then that's a different story. As according to Christ would often say, according to your faith. And the one man cried out, well, help my unbelief. So there's some things we'll talk about. But we better go for now. Thanks for joining us on this third day of the Feast of Tabernacles for 2020. Have a wonderful feast. I think we can, even on a regular feast day, we can say, Chag Sameach. God willing, we'll see you tomorrow. Catch some of the watch parties that I see some people holding with videos from cogtv.org, from the Sabbath Service page of Facebook Live, the Sabbath Service channel from YouTube. Get in on those. Say hello to a few of those people, and let us know. Let people know that you've got Holding Fast, Faithful Minister, doing live streaming. You can see from your home or your hotel room right here. Till tomorrow, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreath. Thanks for joining us. Chag Sameach. Happy Feast. Catch you later.